The Mongol scout who started a war, 1218 AD. A single rider crosses a winter-bleached steppe, and history catches fire. This begins in the dust-streaked borderland between the Mongol Empire and the Khwarezmian world, where caravans vanished and governors weighed gold against fear. Within months of that rider's arrival, a city called Otrar would be soaked in blood, and an empire would wake a giant it could not kill. Here's the first unexpected truth. Contemporary sources record that a caravan of roughly 450 merchants, protected by the Great Khan's seal, was seized and executed in Otrar. But before the caravans burned, before the envoys were humiliated, there was the scout, a man with a sealed message and a name lost to sand. He rode in under a sky the color of iron, carrying words that could have opened markets, or lit the fuse of a war. He approached the gate. He asked for the governor. He handed over the message. The governor's eyes flicked to his guards. A pause, thin as a knife edge. What the scout saw next, he would not survive to report. The rider at the gate. The world in 1218 comes into focus. Mongol discipline, Khwarezmian pride. The nervous arteries of Silk Road trade, and the scout's fatal approach to Otrar ignites a chain reaction. Chapter 2. Otrar's Gamble. Governor Inalchuq weighs rumor, greed, and suspicion. The caravan arrives under Genghis Khan's seal. The first arrests and the first deaths turn a border incident into a provocation. Chapter 3. Words that kill. Envoys cross the desert with demands for justice. Beards are shorn, heads roll, and the sacred law of emissaries is broken. On the steppe, a decision hardens in winter wind. Chapter 4. Siege without mercy. The Mongols come like a storm with siege lines and silent signals. Otrar endures, fractures, and falls. Fate catches the governor who thought he could steal with impunity. Chapter 5. The fire spreads. The invasion spreads to Bukhara and Samarkand. The lesson of the scout becomes a law of empire. We end with a reckoning. What a single choice at a city gate can do to the world. Chapter 1. The rider at the gate. The steppe was a canvas of frost and pale dawn when he crested the ridge. The horse's breath came in plumes. The saddle creaked like an old door. In his fist, a leather tube sealed with a small disc, wax pressed by a signet that no border lord should ignore. The seal meant passage. It meant promise. It meant the weight of a name, Genghis Khan. The scout knew the etiquette. Dismount before the walls. Display the seal. Announce the message. He followed the rules because the rules were supposed to protect him. Ahead, Otrar crouched on the edge of the desert, its walls low and sun-baked, its watchtowers pricked like thorns against a hard sky. Smoke from morning fires rose thin and straight. The city was a hinge between two worlds. To the east, the Mongol steppe, all wind and horizon. To the west, the Khwarezmian dominions, studded with cities and suspicion. It was not a quiet hinge. Caravans rattled through its gates. Whispers traveled faster. He slowed to a trot. He felt the weight of eyes from the parapet. Banners fluttered, green, dust-stained. The guard captain called down in Turkic, harsh and clipped. The scout raised the tube, held it high, let the sun catch the seal. A murmur rolled along the wall like a small wave breaking. The gate yawned open. He rode beneath, the sound of iron on iron echoing around him as the portcullis rattled back into place. The city smelled of wet clay and animal fat, of cumin and tanned leather. Merchants shouted. A boy chased a dog through a puddle and laughed as if empires were a story told to other people. The scout kept his eyes on the keep. He had done this before. Trade and treaty began with riders like him. The governor's hall was a long throat of shadow and torchlight. He was made to wait under painted panels, hunts and saints and battles with horses painted too round, spears sharp as reeds. A cup of sour milk was placed in his hand. He did not drink. When the double doors opened, the scout smelled amber and oil. Inalchuq, governor of Otrar, took his place under a thin window. He was heavy in the jowls and neat in the beard. He wore rings set with stones the color of winter fruit. There were 2 scribes and a man with eyes like a trap. The scout spoke the formal words, offering peace through trade, protection through law, profit through honesty, and he set the leather tube on a cushion. The scribe reached. The seal glinted. The trap-eyed man's mouth trembled in something like a smile. Then everything slowed, like sound under snow. The guard moved in. The cup was pulled from the scout's hand and sniffed as if it were poison. He began to speak again, and a spear butt kissed his knee. He fell. His sleeve was gripped, twisted. The words tangled in his throat. He saw Inalchuq lean forward, not to help, but to look. Not at him, but at the seal. Most people never knew this detail. The laws of the steppe gave absolute protection to messengers, and urban courts knew it. To seize an envoy was to spit in the face of every ruler from the Danube to the desert. But this was an age of rumor and thin nerves. A caravan had been reported behind the scout, rich as a temple's treasury, carrying glass from Aleppo, musk from Tibet, gold leaf like sunflakes. Some said the caravan hid spies. Some said it hid maps. Some said it hid insult. What happened next? No historian expected to end in so much ruin. The leather tube did not travel to a desk. It traveled to a brazier. The seal popped. Wax bubbled. The scribe's hands, veined, careful, trembled as he unfurled the message with iron tongs to keep the ash from staining it. The words were not a threat. They were a courtesy, a request to open the road, to let merchants pass as to make money as men prefer to do. Inalchuq studied the lines in the candlelight. He had what he wanted less than the words. He had the pretext, and this is where everything changed. The scout, still kneeling, still stunned, watched the governor's eyes slide past him to the trap-eyed advisor, to the guards, to the door. The gesture was small, almost lazy. A hand lifted, dropped, the way a man dismisses a fly. The butt of a spear rose. The room filled with the dull thud of wood into flesh, and the thin ring of something hard falling to tile. Somewhere in that sound was the last breath the rider ever took. Outside, the morning narrowed. A wind came off the steppe with a blade hidden in it. Along the road to the east, the caravan was still days away, its bells soft, its pace patient. Men joked under their breaths. They believed in seals and signatures. They believed in the fiction that a symbol could guard a human throat. In Otrar, the governor wrote a letter to his sultan. It was a careful story. He spoke of spies. He spoke of coded threats. He spoke of the safety of his city. He did not speak of greed, the kind that hears of 450 merchants and tastes coin like metal on the tongue. The Sultan, Muhammad II, was a man balancing a dozen knives. To the north of his empire, the Kipchaks grumbled. To the south, the caliph sent advice with teeth in it. To the east, this upstart steppe lord whose name did not soften even in poetry. The Sultan read the report and felt insult rise like a rash. He decided to stand tall. He decided to test the edge of a stranger's patience. And this is the shocking truth. The scout's death could still have been a local crime, punished by local justice, mourned as a mistake. Instead, it became a signal fire, because the next axe would not stop at one man. They would burn parchment and tear beards and hang bodies from gates as if a message could be killed with the man who carried it. Night dropped over the steppe like a lid. Somewhere in the dark, a messenger from Otrar galloped toward Samarkand, where royal perfumes could not sweeten the sweat of fear. Somewhere else, to the east, a rider tore across frozen ground toward the Ik Ordo, the great camp, where Genghis Khan drank his tea black as secrets and listened more than he spoke. The rider brought news of an envoy slain, a seal broken, a law of nations shattered. He did not bring the worst news, because the worst had not yet happened. The caravan reached Otrar under a sky the color of worn steel. They came with their ledgers and led horses and their small domestic arguments about debts and dry bread. They expected a tax. They expected the usual bribes. They did not expect chains. At the gate, the guards' mouths were flat. Hands pushed, voices rose, cords tightened. The law of the road, the old brittle law, cracked in the sound of iron locking bone. Most people never knew this detail. Even then, a solution existed. The great Khan had sent his seal, yes, but he would also send forgiveness in exchange for a single man, Inalchuq, delivered in chains to balance the weight of the crime. The Khwarezmian court could have given up one governor to spare a kingdom. That exchange never happened, because in the bright rooms of Samarkand, pride spoke louder than prudence. Muhammad II chose to test the Mongol taste for injury. He did not understand that the Mongols carved slights into their memory as into wood, and they sanded nothing smooth. Within Otrar's walls, the caravan dissolved into cells and yards and suddenly quiet courtyards. There were men who had seen deserts take friends like a thief, and men who had survived bandits and blizzards and still believed in tomorrow. They waited for tomorrow, and tomorrow did not arrive. One by one, stories ended without witnesses. The governor's coffers swelled. His scribes developed new habits of silence. And this is where fate had something else planned. In the great camp, winter deepened, but another kind of weather gathered, a weather of decision. Genghis Khan listened to counsel. He thought long. He sent envoys to the Sultan with a message that left nothing unclear. Hand over the governor who murdered my men. Honor the seal you broke. The road must be safe. It was a legal demand, as much as a threat. In his world, law was simple. The Sultan's reply was not. Chroniclers later wrote of beards cut and heads severed and one envoy's skull used as a goblet. The worst part is not which version is exact. The worst part is that the sacred treaty of messengers was violated as if it were a piece of string. With that, the matter passed beyond apology. It passed into the realm where armies speak. On the steppe, the Mongol standards rose like black rivers. Horses were counted. Arrows were bound in sheaves. Commanders rehearsed signals in silence, flags flicking like the tongues of fire that would soon lick city walls. A campaign map unfurled, ink tracing rivers that would be crossed in winter, deserts that would be drunk in spring. The Khan divided his force as a butcher knows the joints, cleanly, efficiently. The name Otrar was circled and ringed, not because it was strong, but because it had taught a lesson that needed answering. Otrar's gamble. They thought the road itself would hide the crime. Sand erases hoofprints. Markets swallow whispers. A governor can pay for silence. But the wind on the steppe keeps a better memory than any scribe. At noon, the city shone the color of baked bread. Laughter rose from the bazaar like birds startled from grain. Inalchuq walked the parapet with a goblet in his ringed hand, the cup catching specks of sun as if it were made to drink daylight. He looked outward with a conqueror's squint, though he had not conquered anything. The caravan stood in the yard below, halters clinked to posts, men ranked along the wall with wrists tied in a neat line. A camel groaned like an old hinge. Someone prayed into their shoulder. Someone else gritted teeth as if biting through rope. Inside the keep, the governor's advisor spread new maps on lacquered wood. He was a thin man, and his voice was thinner, a blade that never reflected light. It cut straight to the point. The goods were inventoried, he said. Some perfumes were fresh. Some fabrics were stained. Several sealed chests were heavy enough to crush bone. The advisor did not say greed, but the room tasted of it. Then he said what Inalchuq wanted most to hear. Besides coin, there were letters, roots, contacts, names of men who opened doors in foreign courts. This was more precious than musk. This was leverage. But here's the shocking truth. Those letters were bait without hooks. Merchants always wrote names. Names were currency. Steal them and you owned nothing, unless you also owned fear. Inalchuq nodded as if he understood trade. He understood something else. He understood the feeling that rose in a man when gold stacked like wheat and nobody stood tall enough to say no. The prisoners were marched past the baths and the coppersmith's quarter to a set of courtyards that smelled of lime and ash. The scout's body, wrapped in a rough sheet, had already gone to the ditch. One merchant stumbled when a guard yanked his shoulder. His head struck stone with the sound of a cracked bowl. Another lifted his chin and asked for the law. He spoke in a slow Persian, as if the shape of words could make a shield. The guard answered with his belt. Word travels first to kitchens. Boiled wheat in the pot, paused under the spoon. Grinders leaned into stone and did not push. A boy who sold small brass fish on a string learned a new word that day. Envoy. He rolled it around in his mouth like a date and did not like the taste. He ran to tell his mother that rich men had cried without shame. She put a finger to his lips and said, "Don't speak where walls can listen." And this is where everything changed. The Sultan's decision, far away in Samarkand, arrived at Otrar on a tired horse with foam stiff on its chest. Muhammad's letter was brisk and official, sealed with a stamp that pretended to be good sense. It did not order mercy. It did not order contrition. It ordered thoroughness. If there were spies, find them. If there were letters, take them. If the caravan wore the Khan's seal, be twice as wary. Deliver the useful. Dispose of the rest. Inalchuq smiled when the seal broke. He felt his own spine lengthen, as if the Sultan's words sharpened his vertebrae into a spear. The messenger, handed wine and a slap on the back, drank as if praise could dissolve what he had carried. He left the cup behind when he rode away at dusk, and the cup was rinsed with water that ran pink. Night dropped like a curtain. Torches flared and guttered. In the yard, the merchants lay with ankles roped in pairs. A herdsman from the east, raw-cheeked, quiet, watched the guards play knucklebones by firelight. He listened to the dice click like teeth and felt his mouth fill with a sentence he would never speak. He was thinking of a nephew who could outride the wind. He was thinking of the Khan's standards, black as thunder. He turned to the man bound at his side and murmured a single name that could bring winter to a city. The man did not answer. He had tucked his face into his shoulder and was breathing as if smothering a shout. Most people never knew this detail. One captain on the wall, a veteran with scars like unwound rope, had been born under a sky with no walls. He was Kipchak by blood and city by pay. He had sold his bow to governors long enough to know the price of cowardice. When the scout fell, he had looked away. When the caravan came, he had tightened his jaw and told himself that city men had their own laws. Now he watched moonlight slide along the arrowheads, stacked near the crenellations, and felt an old itch in his palm. The steppe does not forgive insults to messengers. He knew this as surely as he knew that horse sweat dries into salt. He went home to his narrow room and sat with his boots on, listening to his own heart make a sound like hooves. By dawn, Otrar had a new arrangement of fear. The markets opened, but buyers haggled with less heat. Eyes flicked toward the keep and then back, as if checking the weather. Inalchuq sent a report to Samarkand that read like victory. Spies, he wrote, disguised as traitors. Evidence obtained, conspirators neutralized. He signed his name in a hand that had never grasped a bridle too long. And what happened next? No historian expected to start with a river. A thin pillar of dust appeared on the eastern horizon, so slender it could have been a trick of glare. Then another, then a smudge, long and slow and certain. The captain on the wall held the rim of stone and leaned until the notch of the parapet pressed into his ribs. He said nothing. He only breathed out once through his teeth. He knew what a moving horizon meant. The steppe was sending an answer. The first riders were not an army. They were a taste. Scouts in pairs, sliding along ridgelines like wolves pacing meadow edges. They did not come close. They took the measure of the ground and the walls and the water. By the third evening, a small fire winked once on the far ridge and then went dark. The Kipchak captain counted heartbeats. He remembered the signals of his boyhood, the code of light and absence. He went to Inalchuq and said, politely, that the eastern quarter of wall needed more men. The governor laughed. He said, and from which fund shall I pay them? He said, are we a city or a granary for beggars from the grass? This was the turning point. Men below, the captain heard the laugh and did not laugh with it. The sound traveled through the barracks and soured milk in bellies. At noon, a dispute broke out near the tanners over price too low to matter. It ended with a knife. Blood striped the alley. Flies arrived with the indifference of gods. In the keep, the advisor made lists. He liked lists. They made chaos look domesticated. Toward dusk, ox carts rolled from the fields and were stopped at the gate. A girl on a cart peered around the load of fodder and saw the world suddenly narrower. The gatemaster examined every bundle, tapped every plank as if it could sing. He was listening for hollow tones that hid weapons. He found none. He waved the carts through. The girl looked up, saw the captain's serious eyes on the wall, and did not know that those eyes were looking past her to a line of small fires far away in the grass. Each fire burned a specific name in his mind. Jochi, Chagatai, Ogade. The Khan had sons who did not waste time. And this is where everything changed again. A rider came under oath of safe conduct, holding out a message with 2 hands. He stood in the gate's throat with dust on his mouth and said the words all cities fear. Answer for your governor, or your houses will learn the language of fire. He was not killed. He was not even struck. He was laughed at, given a jug of water, and sent back with the same dust on his lips. When he was gone, Inalchuq ordered the small eastern sally port bolted shut and walked to his private room to sit where the light fell exactly on his rings. The climax arrived not with trumpets but with wheels. At midnight, an ox in the southern quarter went wild, lowing high and desperate, breaking the shaft with a noise like a snapped wrist. Dogs answered from alley mouths. Torches swung up and spilled sparks. A runner hit the captain's door with both fists and cried his name. He was taken to the wall, where a strip of ground seemed to be moving. Then the ground lifted its heads, hundreds of small dark heads with eyes like polished seeds and bows that barely glinted. They did not attack. They stood just outside good bow range and made the world feel smaller. A voice on the plain called up in a language the captain had not heard in years, but could still taste, the way a man remembers the river he drank as a boy. Surrender the governor who killed the Khan's men. Open your gates and live. Refuse and teach your children what ash feels like. The translator on the wall stumbled over a syllable. The captain did not. He looked down at the courtyard where the merchant prisoners had once slept. It was empty now, swept with sand as if guilt could be brushed away. Here's the twist most people never consider. The first hand that reached for a gate bar that night was not a Mongol's. It was a city hand. In a back corridor near the granaries, 3 men met in an alcove that smelled of mouse and old grain. One was the Kipchak captain, eyes shadowed by a hood. One was a miller, salt in his beard. One was a clerk who had seen too much ink and too little justice. They spoke without names. They spoke of the law of messengers and the weight of a single death that had brought a black tide to their street. The clerk said his brother had been on the caravan. The miller said his cousin's boy had not come home. The captain said nothing at all. He only moved his hand once, as if calming a horse. But here's the shocking truth, the clerk whispered, voice shaking with more than fear. If we give them the governor, the sultan will hang us anyway. Then we choose who kills us, the miller murmured. Words, oh. That kill the arrow fell without a sound, a black spark vanishing into the courtyard. For one heartbeat, the city held its breath. Then the horn answered, low, steady, rising until it bent the air itself. Otrar had run out of time. The blade at the captain's neck drew one precise line of pain, but the thin-voiced advisor never saw what the steppe teaches. Men who live by command die by instinct. The captain turned into the cut, driving his elbow back. Bone met bone. The advisor's breath left him in a hiss. The flour dust in the air caught the torchlight like smoke. The miller moved first, the key flashing dull. There was a thud, a sigh, and the conspirators were 3 again, but one would never speak. They dragged the body behind sacks of grain. The key found its lock. Metal turned. Outside, the first flight of Mongol arrows struck the outer wall like sudden rain. Otrar woke in chaos. Dogs screamed. Merchants stumbled from their mats. Soldiers grabbed spears they had not sharpened. Inalchuq burst from his chamber, robe half-fastened, demanding numbers. None of his guards had them. From every side, fires bloomed, not to burn yet, but to mark the positions of an army spreading like ink. What happened next? No historian expected. The Mongols did not rush the gate. They surrounded the wells. They cut the irrigation ditches that fed the orchards and filled the cistern with gravel and the corpses of oxen. They turned thirst into a weapon, slow and patient. Days bled into nights of tension. Arrows whistled from the shadows. The city answered with bolts that hit nothing. Inside, food was measured by handfuls. The Kipchak captain commanded the northern wall, his face gaunt but eyes calm. He had once believed honor could live in silence. Now he understood silence was its own kind of crime. Each dawn, he watched the steppe shimmer with heat ghosts. Shapes of riders who might be real or mirage. Most people never knew this detail. Genghis Khan himself did not appear for months. He sent his generals first. Men who treated siege as art. They built earth ramps that crept toward the battlements like glaciers. They dragged machines over miles of sand, disassembling them at night, reassembling them by moonlight. The defenders could hear the rhythm of mallets in the dark, steady, patient, like the ticking of an hourglass. And this is where everything changed. Inside Otrar, the governor's court began to crack. Food for soldiers was cut, while Inalchuq feasted on figs soaked in honey. He summoned astrologers to read the stars for mercy. The stars gave him nothing. The clerk from the granary watched and whispered that gods look away when men forget how to blush. One night, a red light bloomed beyond the eastern wall. Not torchlight, but something heavier, slower. The Mongols had built a siege tower, layer by layer of soaked hides and packed earth, tall enough to cast a moving shadow across the moon. It rolled forward on wheels made from entire tree trunks dragged from far forests. The city trembled with the grind of its approach. Inalchuq ordered the tower burned, but every arrow and oil jar fell short. The tower stopped just out of reach, silent and waiting, like a beast that knows hunger has no need to hurry. Then the wind turned. It blew from the steppe into the city, carrying smoke that made men cough until they bent double. Behind that smoke came sound, the deep, thunderous thump of drums. For the first time, the defenders heard voices singing in a language older than the walls, a song of gathering. Fear found its rhythm. Here's the shocking truth. While Inalchuq prayed for miracle, his own men began to trade messages with the besiegers. A single coin tied to a string could buy a word of pardon. A promise of safe passage could buy betrayal. In the cellar of the armory, the captain found one of his sergeants trying to smuggle his family through a drainage tunnel. He did not punish him. He only said, "If they reach the grass, do not stop riding." By the 40th day, the well stank. Horses drank brackish water. The governor ordered wine rationed for himself alone. In the square, citizens gathered around the dry fountain and cursed under their breath. Someone threw a stone at the keep. No one confessed. The turning point came at dawn when the Mongols suddenly retreated from the outer works. Drums ceased. Banners dipped. Dust clouds thinned until only silence remained. The defenders stared, stunned, thinking perhaps heaven had relented. Inalchuq laughed loud enough for the echo to sound like victory. He sent scouts to taunt the enemy's empty lines, but fate had something else planned. When the scouts reached the first abandoned camp, they found trenches running like veins through the earth. Trenches filled not with soldiers, but with fire. Tar pits. When lit, they turned the ground itself into a moat of flame. The Mongols had simply shifted position, moving unseen through their own smoke to the city's weaker western wall. The first explosion of fire reached the ramparts before any order could be shouted. The heat blew men backward, faces blackened, eyes screaming. Siege machines rolled forward under cover of that inferno, throwing stones the size of ox skulls. The captain rallied what archers he could, their arrows hissing into the smoke, but the wall was already cracking. And this was the climax. The moment pride met physics. One catapult stone struck the same spot 3 times. On the 4th, the parapet collapsed inward. The Mongols surged through the breach, not shouting, only breathing hard, disciplined as a single body. Their eyes were slit against smoke. Their blades moved as if guided by one mind. The captain fought on the stairs, slipping in dust and blood. He killed until his bowstring snapped, then drew his knife. He saw the governor's banners falling above him like dead leaves. When the wall finally broke completely, he did not run. He lifted the fallen banner once, just to prove that someone still remembered the law of messengers. Most people never knew this. Inalchuq was not captured in battle. He hid inside the treasury, surrounded by sacks of coin. When Mongol soldiers dragged him out, he spat curses until they gagged him with his own seal-stamped robe. The coin spilled like grains of sand, and the torchlight made them look like embers. But the story does not end there. The Mongol commander did not kill him immediately. He sent word east to the Khan himself. The message carried only 7 words. "We have the man who broke the law." And this is where everything changes again. For Genghis Khan, the death of envoys was not a wound. It was a debt. Debts must be collected in full. Otrar burned for 5 days. Its smoke was seen from the next city west. The steppe wind scattered ash across fields that would not grow for years. Yet even in that ruin, one corridor of the keep remained sealed. The Mongols pried it open on the 6th morning. Inside, they found a ledger wrapped in silk, a list of names, routes, and markets. The same letters Inalchuq had stolen from the merchants. It became the map for the next campaign, and what happened next? No city beyond Otrar was ready to face. The drums fell silent. The horses rested. The dust settled. From the heart of the ruined city, the captain's body was carried on a cart of reeds. A single surviving merchant, blind in one eye, whispered a prayer for him, and for the scout whose blood had started this all. Far away, in the Khan's encampment, a messenger dismounted and bowed low. He held up a token, a severed ear wrapped in cloth, and said, "Justice waits for your command." The Khan looked past him to the horizon, where the sun burned a pale wound in the sky. He did not speak. He only pointed west, and somewhere beyond that horizon lay Samarkand. The next name on the ledger, the next debt to collect. The wind rose again, carrying the smell of ashes and horse sweat. The drums began to sound once more, slow and measured. as if the earth itself were counting the steps of vengeance. What followed would make Otrar's fire look like the spark before the storm. Siege without mercy. The dawn after Otrar fell was the quietest the steppe had ever known. The smoke drifted low and cold, settling over the ruins like a shroud. Every stone still held heat. Every alley smelled of iron and burned grain. On the horizon the sky blushed red, but not from sunrise, from what was still burning. And in that silence, the great Khan spoke. His generals stood around him, faces wrapped in dust, armor crusted with frost. They had ridden through the night to bring him proof. Inalchuq, the governor who had killed the scout, bound in chains blackened by fire. His eyes were swollen, his lips cracked, his tongue heavy with pleas he could no longer form. The Mongols had not killed him yet. They had kept him alive for the Khan's eyes. Genghis Khan rose from his seat slowly. He was not the towering monster stories later made him. He was smaller than most of his guards, built of rope and scar, eyes the color of melted flint. He said nothing at first. He only studied the governor's face, the trembling, the cracked pride, the faint, stupid hope. Then he nodded once. "Bring him water," the Khan said. "He was thirsty when he murdered my men. Let him drink." They brought a cup, but not of water. It was molten silver, poured until it filled his mouth and lungs. He died with his eyes open, staring at the man he had tried to cheat. Most people never knew this detail. That execution became legend, not because of its cruelty, but because of what it meant. The Khan had turned a single insult into an unbreakable law. No one touches the messenger of the Mongols in lives. From that day, every ambassador under his banner rode with invisible armor, made of fear. But this was only the beginning. Otrar's fall was a warning, not the war itself. The real storm still gathered beyond the horizon, and its name was vengeance. The Khan divided his army like a blade splitting along its grain. Jibi, the arrow, rode north with the speed of a hawk. Subutai, the iron strategist, carved a line through the passes, and the Khan himself moved west toward the beating heart of Khwarezm, Bukhara, Samarkand, the jeweled cities of the Silk Road. The riders left Otrar in columns that darkened the land. From above, it would have looked like veins spreading from a wound. Dust clouds followed them for days, and beneath that dust moved the most disciplined army the world had ever seen. Archers whose arrows could blind the sun, engineers who could turn rivers, spies who spoke 10 tongues. But here's the shocking truth. The Khan never marched blind. His scouts rode months ahead, mapping wells, measuring walls, bribing gatekeepers. They wore the clothes of traders, pilgrims, even monks. When they returned, they carried sketches of towers and whispered names of traitors waiting to be paid. One of those scouts, they said, was a survivor from the Otrar caravan, a merchant who had once been bound in the governor's yard. He had escaped through a drainage tunnel on the first night of fire, crawling through filth and ash until the steppe air cut his lungs. When Mongol scouts found him, he was half blind, half mad. But he still remembered the map of the Khwarezmian heartlands, and he wanted to see them burn. The Khan listened to him in silence, then placed a cup of kumis in his hand and said, "You will have your road again, paved with their bones." And this is where everything changed. When the Mongols reached Bukhara in the spring of 1220, the city still believed its walls could hold the sky. They were high and clean, their bricks glazed blue and gold. The mosque domes shone like inverted bowls of light. Within those walls, the citizens prayed, traded, and whispered that the barbarians from the east could not take a city protected by Allah's will. Then one morning, the horizon moved. At first, it looked like dust. Then it became shapes. Ranks of horses, black banners, and siege engines rolling like thunder. Bukhara's gates slammed shut. The call to prayer drowned beneath the drums of war. The Mongols did not waste arrows on arrogance. They surrounded the city, dug trenches, and cut the roads. When the wells were poisoned, they opened the floodgates of a nearby canal and turned the city's gardens into a swamp. The defenders shot arrows from the walls, but the Mongols answered with fire pots that screamed through the air and burst into the roofs below. Still, Bukhara held for days, until someone inside opened the gate. Most people never knew this detail. The gatekeeper's name was Yusuf, a stablemaster whose son had been taken as a slave by Khwarezmian tax collectors years before. When the Mongols promised his child's freedom, Yusuf guided them through a postern gate hidden beneath the bridge by the canal. By dawn, Bukhara's streets were full of hooves. The Khan rode straight to the city's grand mosque. He dismounted, walked across the carpeted floor still stained with oil and blood, and said to the terrified crowd, "If you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like me upon you." He ordered the treasures of the city distributed among his men. The muezzin's call still hung in the air as the mosque filled with the sound of soldiers dividing spoils. Yet the Khan forbade them from desecrating the Quran. He picked it up himself, brushed away the dust, and placed it back on its stand. And that was the twist no one expected. The so-called barbarian showed more reverence for the sacred text than the rulers who had provoked his wrath. It was a gesture that echoed like prophecy through generations. From Bukhara, the Khan rode to Samarkand, the Sultan's pride, a city of turquoise domes and silk markets that glittered like dreams. The Sultan, Muhammad II, gathered a vast army, 50,000 men strong, armored like beetles under the sun. He believed the walls of Samarkand were high enough to keep heaven itself out. But fate had something else planned. The Mongols came from every direction, east, north, and south, their siege engines dragging death through dust. Their arrows fell like rain, their drums shook the ground. Still, Samarkand's garrison fought fiercely for 4 days. On the 5th, a division of the Sultan's own Turkic mercenaries switched banners from blue to black. They opened the northern gate. The Mongols poured in. The streets turned into rivers of blood and smoke. The Sultan's palace caught fire, its gilded ceiling collapsing in waves of heat. The Khan entered the city slowly, not in triumph, but in silence. He stood before the citadel where Muhammad's banners had flown and said only, "A wise ruler defends his people. A proud one buries them." But the Sultan was gone. He had fled west, chased by ghosts and guilt, disguised as a commoner, hiding in deserts and mountains until fever took him. They say he died alone on an island in the Caspian Sea, whispering the name of the man he had angered. And this is the shocking truth. The war that began with one scout's death did not end with the Sultan's. It birthed an empire that would stretch from China to the edge of Europe, carried on the same wind that once rustled the banners of Otrar. But even victory has its shadow. As the Khan's armies rested in the ashes of Samarkand, a messenger arrived from the western steppes. His horse was near collapse, his face gray with dust. He carried news not of triumph, but betrayal. A trusted general, they said, had broken ranks. A surviving Khwarezmian prince had escaped south. The fire was not yet out, and the wind was changing. The Khan turned to the west, where the sun bled into the horizon. He said nothing. But those near him saw the look in his eyes and knew another storm was already forming. The drums began again, slower this time, deeper, like the heartbeat of something vast and unfinished. And somewhere far beyond the steppe, another city waited, unaware that history was already galloping toward its gates. What happened next would make even the conqueror's shadow tremble. The fire spreads. They said the wind that left Samarkand carried the smell of endings. For months afterward, travelers on the road to the Oxus swore they could still taste ash in their bread, still hear faint hooves in the distance long after the last Mongol banner vanished from sight. But the war was not finished. The war was only changing shape. The Khan rode west with no need for speeches. Behind him, cities smoldered in neat rows, each one a page torn from the Sultan's pride. Ahead lay the final debt. The Khwarezmian prince Jalal ad-Din, the last ember of a dying dynasty. The son who refused to kneel. The Khan's scouts brought back reports like ripples in a dark pond. Jalal ad-Din had rallied fugitives, remnants of Samarkand's army, loyal tribes, desperate survivors, men with nothing left to lose. He had crossed the Oxus and carved a brief sanctuary in the mountains of Persia. His followers called him the Lion of Khwarezm. But even lions bleed. What happened next? No chronicler could make sense of without awe. In the winter of 1221, the Mongol army split again as it always did. Not chaos, but a rhythm of division. Subutai rode north to crush resistance near the Caspian. Jabi took the deserts. The Khan himself rode south, where the land curved into valleys so narrow that 2 horses could not pass abreast. He moved like wind through a flute, silent, searching for the one note that would end the song. Most people never knew this detail. Every campaign began with a moment of prayer. Not to gods, but to the sky itself. The Khan would face the horizon, close his eyes and whisper the names of his sons, the living and the dead. Then he would ride. To him, war was not rage. It was balance. The governor of Otrar had tipped the scales. Now the scales were being righted, city by city, throat by throat. By spring, the Mongols reached the river Indus. The Khwarezmian prince stood on the far bank with his battered army, 30,000 men who had survived the impossible. Jalal ad-Din had the courage of a cornered wolf. He burned his own bridge behind him, forcing his men to fight or drown. The Khan watched from a ridge. The wind carried the smell of water and blood. Below, 2 worlds collided, Mongol precision against desperate valor. The Khwarezmians fought like men whose souls had already left their bodies. Lances shattered, shields splintered, and the riverbank turned into mud slick with red. And this was the climax. Jalal ad-Din himself charged into the fray, his black horse plunging through Mongol ranks, cutting left, then right, until he reached the Khan's guard. For a heartbeat, he was close enough for their eyes to meet across the chaos. The Khan did not raise his bow. He only watched, silent, calculating, almost admiring. Then fate intervened. The Khwarezmian line broke. Panic rippled. The survivors fled toward the river. Jalal ad-Din refused to yield. Surrounded, he spurred his horse to the cliff's edge and leapt. The horse hit the Indus like a stone dropped from heaven. They surfaced far below, gasping, swallowed by current and spray. When the Mongols reached the cliff, they saw him on the far shore, soaked and breathing, staring back. Genghis Khan, still mounted, raised one hand. He told his men to let him go. Let him live, the Khan said. Such a son is not born twice. That mercy was rarer than fire. It was the twist that even history seemed to hold its breath for. The war was over, but its shadow wasn't. The Mongols now ruled from China to the Caspian. Their banners fluttered over empty capitals and haunted silence. Caravan roads that once traded silk now traded stories. Stories of walls that fell without siege, of riders who could drink the wind, of the silver death poured for a governor who broke his oath. But here's the shocking truth. The Mongol expansion that began as vengeance became a system. What had started with blood turned into order. From the ashes rose a new network of roads and messengers, guarded by the very law that the scout's death had violated. No one harms an envoy. The Khan enforced it with brutal consistency. Traders moved from the Yellow Sea to Byzantium under the same rule. Touch the seal of the Khan, and your throat will never see tomorrow's light. For a generation, the world held its breath. Under Mongol rule, ideas and goods crossed continents. The Silk Road thrived again, ironic perhaps. That the man whose messenger was murdered became history's greatest protector of messengers. And yet, even the Khan could not conquer time. Years later, as he rode through the mountains of western China, his beard silvered and his gaze distant, the old conqueror stopped by a river. He dismounted, scooped a handful of water, and let it pour through his fingers. His generals watched, puzzled. "This," he said, "is how the world remembers." He opened his hand. The river took the water back, as if swallowing memory. And this is where everything changed again. The scout who started it all, his name still lost to history, became something greater than a man. He became the hinge on which empires turned. Because of him, a governor died in molten silver. Because of him, cities burned, borders shifted, and the world learned to fear a seal pressed in wax. But the story does not end with victory or peace. The story ends where all great fires end, in silence, smoke, and the faint echo of hoofbeats fading into history. Most people never knew this. The Mongol scouts who rode after the Khan's death still told his tale in whispers, by campfires. When one asked where the first spark began, the older riders would nod east, toward Otrar, and say, "There, one man with a message. One man who rode alone." And as the flames of their campfire danced in the wind, they would add softly, "Never kill the messenger." The world is still paying for that mistake. The wind on the steppe rises again, carrying ash, memory, and the faint jingle of distant harness bells. Somewhere, a horse shifts in the dark. Somewhere, the past turns over in its sleep. The story of the Mongol scout who started a war ends not with the clash of swords, but with the whisper of dust returning to dust. And so, on that blood-soaked road between Otrar and eternity, empires fell, legends were born, and history was never the same again. The echo of ashes. The steppe was silent again, not the silence of peace, but of exhaustion, the kind that settles after the last scream fades and even the vultures have flown on. The Mongol banners stood limp in the wind, their edges crusted with soot. Beneath them, the world that had once been Khwarezm was nothing but wind-blown memory. And yet, history never ends where men think it should. Months after the fall of Jalal ad-Din's army, small fires still burned in the valleys. Not battles, resistance. Bands of survivors moved like ghosts through the ruins of their own cities. They struck supply trains, vanished into reeds, and left behind nothing but hoofprints and whispers. The Khan called them the echo of the dead. But here's the shocking truth. Even as the Mongols hunted rebels, the empire began to change from within. Conquest had become administration. The same riders who once carried arrows now carried scrolls, sealed in red wax. Cities rebuilt under new laws. Trade revived along roads paved with fear and order. Across thousands of miles, the word of the Khan traveled faster than any army ever had, on the backs of messengers who rode without fear of chains. And this is where everything changed. One evening, in the great camp near the Ili River, a young courier returned from the far west. His horse collapsed at the threshold, foam on its muzzle, eyes white. The rider staggered to his knees before the Khan's tent, holding a small packet bound in silk. Inside was a single arrowhead, rusted, chipped, unmistakably Khwarezmian. The Khan studied it in silence. "Even ashes remember the spark," he said. Then he looked toward the horizon. "So long as men carry messages, the world will carry conflict." Most people never knew this detail. The courier's name was Batu. Decades later, he would ride west again and burn the cities of Europe. In that moment, he was only a boy receiving the same lesson that had once begun with a nameless scout. A lesson carved into every Mongol heart. Words can start wars faster than swords. The Khan rose and dismissed his council. Alone, he walked out onto the plain. The stars above the steppe shimmered like the tips of arrows. He whispered something only the night could hear. "Forgiveness is the only thing I never conquered." The wind carried the words away, across the grasslands, where once a single rider had galloped toward Otrar, carrying a letter of peace that became a death sentence. The cycle had closed, but its echo would never stop. And this was the turning point that history forgot. After the Khan's death, his sons divided the empire. They argued over borders, faith, inheritance, each claiming to know his will. Yet even in their quarrels, one law remained untouched: never harm the messenger. That single command outlived palaces, dynasties, and even the empire itself. In distant courts centuries later, envoys would still carry safe conduct letters inscribed with its ghost: by the will of the sky and the memory of the Khan. But fate had something else planned. Centuries would pass. Empires would rise and fall, and somewhere, a modern diplomat, stepping from an armored car in a foreign city, would glance at the seal on his papers and feel, without knowing why, a flicker of ancient fear. Because buried in every embassy, every flag of truce, every handshake between enemies, lies that first story, the Mongol scout who rode out of the east and knocked on the wrong gate. And this is the shocking truth. The world still runs on messages, and men still kill because they do not like what those messages contain. The lesson of Otrar was not vengeance. It was consequence. It was how one act of arrogance can teach the planet obedience for centuries. The wind rose again over the empty plains. In its sound was the memory of hooves, and in that rhythm, the faint heartbeat of a man long forgotten. He rides still through dust and time, not for conquest now, but for remembrance. For he was only a messenger, and the world set itself on fire trying to silence him.